Britain is a country known for its vast green landscapes, high cliffs, and constant rainfall. Due to its geographical location, it has historically maintained continuous interaction with continental Europe, and in this process, it became home to one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, England. Although it may seem like a small country, a closer look at its history reveals that it is more than just a place. It is a living testament to thousands of years of migration, war, and cultural adaptation. This raises a question in people's minds: how did these lands become a power capable of influencing world history? The story of England begins around 11,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. At that time, the British Isles were connected to continental Europe by a land bridge called Doggerland. However, as the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, submerging this bridge and permanently separating Britain from Europe. This separation did not halt cultural exchanges. Around 4000 BCE, agricultural methods originating from the Middle East reached these regions. At the same time, remarkable tombs and ceremonial stone circles, such as Stonehenge, began to be constructed. Stonehenge is not merely a structure made of giant stones. On the contrary, each stone was carefully shaped and arranged according to a complex design. The small blue stones there were brought from the Preseli Hills, 250 kilometers away. The mortises on the lintels above the monumental sarsen stones were designed to fit onto the protrusions above them, like Lego bricks. This meticulous craftsmanship symbolizes hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of labor. Archaeological findings provide important insights into the lives of these ancient builders. At the Stonehenge Visitor Center, reconstructed huts based on experimental archaeology showcase their daily life. Considering that these people had responsibilities such as feeding their families and providing shelter, the significance of such a massive structure becomes clearer. Just like us, they needed to live, produce food, and continue their economic activities, beyond merely constructing a mysterious and colossal monument. As the Stone Age transitioned into the Bronze Age, much of Britain underwent a similar evolution to other parts of Europe. Waves of migration from the continent brought new cultural and linguistic practices. This process culminated in the Celtic culture spreading across Western Europe by the 12th century BCE. Contrary to common assumptions, Celtic tribes during the Iron Age were not primitive but rather highly developed agricultural communities. They prospered through trade connections with the European mainland and also faced various invasions. Despite conflicts among themselves, they spoke a common language and shared beliefs that are the roots of modern Celtic languages. During these wars, impressive defensive structures such as Maiden Castle were constructed. The religious beliefs of the period resembled the pagan traditions widespread in northwestern Europe. The Romans noted that religious rituals in Britain were very similar to those practiced by the Gauls. Druidism was one of the notable aspects of this era. Druids were not only priests but also served as political leaders, doctors, judges, historians, and advisors, representing the elite of society. Their ideas had a profound impact on the public. They were quite distant from writing, believing that writing weakened memory, and preferred to transmit knowledge orally. Therefore, most of what we know about Iron Age Britain comes from archaeological remains and Roman manuscripts. The first written records concerning Britain emerged in 55 BCE when Julius Caesar attempted to conquer the island. Caesar claimed that the Britons were supporting the peoples of Gaul in their resistance against Rome as a justification for his attack. However, his two expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE did not result in permanent territorial gains. The true Roman conquests began about 90 years later, in 43 CE, during the reign of Emperor Claudius. Claudius's desire to strengthen his own image was one of the main reasons behind this major conquest. Since his contemporaries regarded him as weak and foolish, he wanted to succeed where Julius Caesar had failed. Initially, 40,000 Roman soldiers viewed Britain as an unknown land, believed to be inhabited by wild barbarians and monsters. Nevertheless, they landed at the coast with minimal resistance. A strategic mistake by the local Catuvellauni tribe allowed the Romans to disembark almost unopposed. Upon settling on the island, the Romans built forts, erected victory monuments, and advanced inland. Many tribes surrendered without resistance to Rome's unstoppable military power. In open terrain, the Britons had limited chances. However, during guerrilla warfare, the Romans became more vulnerable. Claudius's appearance on an elephant amazed the local population and further cemented Rome's power. Although Roman rule took root in Britain, it occasionally faced major uprisings, such as the one led by Queen Boudicca. Around 60 CE, Boudicca of the Iceni tribe launched a massive revolt following the death of her husband, the mistreatment of her people by the Romans, her own assault, and the suffering of her daughters. This rebellion led to the deaths of thousands and the burning of 3 cities. It was so intense that Emperor Nero even considered a complete withdrawal from Britain. However, Boudicca was eventually defeated and likely committed suicide to avoid capture. After this event, Britain remained a strong Roman province for about 350 years, until 410 CE. This long Roman administration left lasting legacies for modern England, including roads, advanced infrastructure, cities like Londra, Chester, and York, and most importantly, Christianity. By the late 4th century CE, the territories of the Roman Empire, particularly in Western Europe, began to experience severe decline due to the incursions and attacks of Germanic tribes. As part of a strategy to withdraw from distant regions, Rome gradually began leaving Britain from the 370s CE onwards. By 410 CE, the number of Roman soldiers remaining on the island was very low. Emperor Honorius announced that the Britons would have to take responsibility for their own defense, as Rome could no longer provide soldiers or resources to these distant lands. This collapse brought about a major transformation for the Britons. Roman-era British culture quickly became isolated from continental Europe. Although the people continued to practice Christianity, in many ways, they returned to pre-Roman ways of life. They attempted to establish their own defense systems in the Roman style, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. When the Picts from Scotland and the Irish from Ireland began raiding the island, the Britons sought solutions in a Roman-like manner. Germanic mercenaries brought from northern Germany, known for their effectiveness in warfare, namely the Angles and Saxons, were employed to deal with the Picts. The Picts were defeated, but in return, land in the city was given to the Saxons. This decision soon triggered broader Anglo-Saxon migrations. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain was a complex process. Some historians describe this as a serious invasion and forced displacement of the local population, while others interpret it as a more peaceful and gradual cultural transition. Regardless, the result was that the Anglo-Saxons transformed the Romano-British language, culture, and people with their own Germanic traditions and way of life. Their language eventually evolved into modern English. Around 500 CE, the Britons, led by Ambrosius Aurelianus, secured their existence by defeating the Saxons at the Battle of Mons Badonicus. Following this victory, the Saxons remained in eastern England, while the Britons continued to inhabit the west, particularly in regions like Wales and Cornwall. The legends of King Arthur are also attributed to this period, particularly to the victory at Mons Badonicus and the long period of peace that followed. Historians note that this process was not just an invasion but also a large-scale migration. Northern Germanic communities such as the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians spoke similar languages and could communicate easily with one another. Over time, differences among these tribes lost significance, and they decided to call themselves the Anglo-Saxons, or in their own language, the Anglicans. The name England comes from the word England, meaning the land of the Angles. From the 500s to the 800s CE, Anglo-Saxon England was under the rule of numerous kingdoms, whose exact number is uncertain. During this period, prominent kingdoms such as Kent, Wessex, Sussex, Mercia, and Northumbria emerged. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons had begun transitioning from their old Germanic pagan beliefs to Christianity. This change connected them to the wider European community. Despite all the conflicts, this period was marked by the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon language, religion, and culture, along with economic stability and prosperity. By the late 8th century, the Anglo-Saxons had united into 4 major kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. In the late 4th century CE, the territories of the Roman Empire, especially in Western Europe, began to be shaken by the attacks and raids of Germanic tribes. As part of a strategy of withdrawal from distant regions, Rome gradually began leaving Britain from the 370s CE onward. By 410 CE, the number of Roman soldiers remaining on the island had drastically decreased. Emperor Honorius informed the Britons that they would have to take responsibility for their own defense, as Rome could no longer provide troops or resources to protect this distant land. This collapse brought a profound transformation for the Britons. Roman Britain's culture quickly became isolated from continental Europe. Although the people continued to practice Christianity, in many ways, they reverted to pre-Roman ways of life. They attempted to build their own defenses in the Roman style, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. King Alfred made his mark in history as a great leader. When he ascended the throne in 871, England was in chaos and crisis. The Vikings had taken control of the eastern and northeastern regions, establishing their bases and raiding the local population. Alfred, even in this desperate situation, remained calm, strategic, and able to turn problems into opportunities. He believed that all the people of the island needed to unite under a single kingdom. He even had the unconventional idea of including the Vikings in this united kingdom. It can be assumed that the Vikings sought wealth and fertile lands, and Alfred predicted that their desire to fight would diminish once they acquired sufficient riches. To this end, he developed a system called Danegeld. When the Vikings attacked Wessex, Alfred offered them money instead of engaging in battle. This proposal became attractive to many Vikings, who realized that the Anglo-Saxons were not easy targets. This system prevented Saxon forces from being continuously worn down by warfare and demonstrated that peace could be achieved among rival groups around common interests. In 878, after defeating the Vikings at the Battle of Edington, Alfred showed them mercy and encouraged them to adopt Christianity. This led some Vikings, weary of war, to convert. In 886, Alfred captured London and, with the support of his son Edward and Mercian Prince Ethelred, achieved successive victories against the Vikings. His strategy proved successful. The Anglo-Saxons gradually reclaimed English lands. When Alfred died in 899, his son Edward inherited his legacy. Edward's sister Ethelflaed married Prince Ethelred, and after Ethelred's death, she assumed the rule of Mercia. This event led to a de facto union between the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. The two siblings continued to reclaim lands held by the Vikings. Ethelflaed passed away in 921, leaving Edward as the sole ruler of their kingdoms. When Edward died in 925, he left his son Aethelstan a kingdom larger than any king had previously ruled. Aethelstan was crowned as king of all the English, completing the process of establishing the Kingdom of England. However, this unity did not last long. In 978, the Vikings returned to England under the leadership of Danish King Harald Bluetooth. At that time, King Ethelred had ascended the throne unprepared and lacked the strength to confront the Vikings. To ensure England's survival, he had to pay tribute to the Vikings for 20 years, which severely strained the kingdom's economy. In 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of Norwegian settlers in his territories. This decision proved disastrous and triggered a new war with the Danish Vikings that lasted 10 years. In 1044, Danish king Knut Forkbeard died, and Ethelred fled to Norway. Meanwhile, the English throne was left vacant. Knut's son, Canute, defeated Etheld's son Edmund and claimed the throne, becoming King of England. Canute extended his rule to include Denmark and Norway, establishing the North Sea Empire. He thus became one of the two rulers in English history known for this great title. However, this empire quickly fragmented after his death in 1035. In 1042, the Anglo-Saxon dynasty returned with Edward the Confessor ascending the throne. Edward died in 1066 without leaving an heir, triggering a new succession crisis. The powerful noble Harold Godwin's son quickly declared himself king. That same year, Norwegian King Harald Hardrada invaded England. Hardrada suffered a heavy defeat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge and was killed by an arrow. This event marked the end of the Viking Age. The Vikings left a lasting impact on English language, culture, and settlements, laying the foundations of cities such as Dublin. Additionally, they paved the way for England's future conquerors, the Normans. Just 3 days after Harold Godwinson's victory over the Vikings, in 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England. William had a strong claim to the English throne due to his kinship with Edward the Confessor, and much of Europe believed the throne rightfully belonged to him. The Normans were descendants of Vikings who had conquered this region about 150 years earlier and integrated with French society. The name Normandy derives from the word Northman, meaning northern people. At the Battle of Hastings, William's Norman army of approximately 10,000 faced an Anglo-Saxon army of 8,000. The Normans, with superior archery and cavalry, defeated the Anglo-Saxons. According to legend, King Harold was struck by an arrow at the end of the battle and died. On Christmas Day in 1066, William was crowned as the new ruler of England. The Norman conquest initiated a profound transformation in English governance. William suppressed successive English uprisings and established authority over neighbouring kingdoms in Wales and Scotland. To document the lands, people, and economic power of his kingdom, he commissioned the Domesday Book. This detailed record revealed that nearly all Anglo-Saxon nobles had been replaced by Normans and that French became the language of the ruling aristocracy. The fusion of Norman French with Old English eventually gave rise to modern English. Additionally, the widespread practice of slavery in England gradually declined. William died in 1087. His descendants failed to continue his successes, and succession disputes plunged the country into civil wars. England entered a period of anarchy lasting 17 years, during which King Stephen and Matilda, daughter of King Henry, fought a bloody conflict over the throne. The struggle became even more complex when Matilda married Geoffrey of Anjou and had a son named Henry. In 1152, the civil war ended, and Stephen remained on the throne until his death in 1154. That same year, Matilda's son Henry ascended the throne, taking the title of Henry, and established the Plantagenet dynasty. This dynasty ruled extensive territories stretching from northern England to the Pyrenees. During Henry's reign, England was still governed by a French-speaking aristocracy. Henry's own English was limited. With his strong will, ambitious and energetic personality, he reclaimed powers from the barons and expanded his empire. However, his harsh approach led to family conflicts and tragic events. The most famous of these was his dispute with Archbishop Thomas Becket. Henry's angry words led four of his knights to murder Becket in 1170, severely damaging Henry's reputation in Europe. In 1189, following Henry, his son Richard ascended the throne. His successes in major battles earned him the title Richard the Lionheart. During the Third Crusade, he fought against Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and sought to protect his territories in France. However, as King of England, he spent only 6 months of his reign in the country. To him, the kingdom was largely a support base for his broader European empire. In 1199, he was killed by an arrow in France. Richard was succeeded by his younger brother John, who did not emerge as a notably positive leader. He launched unsuccessful rebellions against his father and brother, and in Ireland he displayed greed and a lust for power. It was during this period that the legend of Robin Hood emerged. He lost Normandy to France and the Angevin Empire began to crumble. To make up for these losses, he imposed heavy taxes on the people. He confiscated the lands of the nobility and the church. He even forced the daughters of noble families into marriage and had one of his rivals killed in prison. These oppressions encouraged the nobles and the church to rebel. On the 15th of June, 1215, based on a draft prepared by the Archbishop of Canterbury, King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. This document contained 63 new clauses that restricted the king's powers in favor of the church and the barons. Although it did not yet directly affect the common people, it introduced the idea of the rule of law and that the king must obey God's laws. The Magna Carta established a system in which many royal decisions would require the consent of the nobles, laying foundations for the modern parliament. John signed the document reluctantly and never truly intended to abide by its rules. Very soon the Pope annulled the Magna Carta. This led to a civil war that continued until John's death. Although it initially faced great difficulties, the principles introduced by the Magna Carta became one of the turning points in English history. John's son Henry fought for the Magna Carta's validity and convened an assembly that could be seen as an early prototype of modern parliament. He was succeeded by Edward, known as Longshanks because of his tall stature, who became famous for his victories against Scotland. During his reign he suppressed revolts in Wales, reorganized the English legal system, and strengthened the monarchy's power. He ensured that Parliament continued as a permanent institution and raised taxes through it to finance his wars. He also initiated the expulsion of the Jews, which lasted until the 17th century. He fought a long and costly war in Scotland against William Wallace and other nobles. He captured the Stone of Scone and brought it to England. Although this stone is still regarded as belonging to England, it is currently kept in Scotland. Edward's weak son, also named Edward, lost some lands in Scotland to Robert de Bruce and was generally regarded as an ineffective ruler. His reign coincided with a 2-year famine that affected about 10% of England's population. In 1327 he was deposed, and the country came under the joint rule of Mortimer and Queen Isabella. This rule ended when a later Edward had Mortimer killed. The early years of Edward III's reign were dominated by ongoing conflicts with Scotland, but these eventually led to a truce and temporary peace in the region. During this period the alliance between Scotland and France emerged as a new threat to England. The long-standing rivalry between England and France culminated in the 100 Years' War, which began in 1337 and lasted until 1453. Under Edward's leadership, England pressed its claims to the French throne and won important victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The English longbow became one of their major advantages on the battlefield. Henry V's victory at Agincourt made him master of northern France, and he secured heirs to the French throne by marrying a French princess. However, Henry V died in 1422 and his son Henry VI, still a child, became king of both England and France. A leader who changed the course of the war then appeared, Joan of Arc. A peasant girl who said that the saints had tasked her with expelling the English from France, Joan at first was not taken seriously by the French king, but her accurate predictions about the coming battles changed opinions. Joan directed the French forces to lift the siege of Orleans, achieving a major success there. She later became commander of the French forces. Initially the French hesitated to accept the leadership of a peasant girl, but Joan's victories convinced them. Yet at the age of only 19 she was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. The English accused her of heresy and executed her by burning. Joan's death galvanized the French and helped them regain the upper hand shortly thereafter. The 100 Years' War technically ended with the Battle of Castillon in 1453, and England lost most of its territories in France. Official hostilities continued for another 20 years on paper, but England's hold on the French throne was effectively ended. After this war, England transitioned into the early modern period. Social, technological, and administrative changes emerged, and the country stood at the threshold of a new age. While the 100 Years' War continued, another conflict erupted within England. The Wars of the Roses. This civil war was fought between two branches of the Plantagenet family, the Lancasters, represented by the Red Rose, and the Yorks. Although it was not as dramatically portrayed in Shakespeare's works, the war lasted about 30 years and deeply affected England. In 1485 the Wars of the Roses ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor, who claimed a disputed right to the throne from the Lancaster line, defeated and killed Richard III to end the war. Henry married Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV, a York, thereby uniting the Lancaster and York families and founding the Tudor dynasty. The new English ruler of the Renaissance era, Henry VII, had to eliminate the uncertainties created by the Wars of the Roses and consolidate his throne. He shaped his foreign policy carefully, strengthening ties with Scotland and France. He died in 1509 and was succeeded by his 17-year-old son Henry VIII. Henry had become king after the earlier death of Arthur 7 years prior. He married Catherine of Aragon, who had been Arthur's widow. Learning that Catherine had 2 stillborn infants and only one surviving daughter, Mary, deeply worried Henry. This concern would trouble England for many years. Seeking personal prestige and fame, Henry engaged in minor conflicts with France and Scotland. His obsession with producing a male heir led him to a bold decision. In 1527 he sought a divorce from his wife. When the Pope refused to grant it, Henry's reaction was unexpected. He broke with the church and established his own church. This event is known as the English Reformation and is often seen less as a purely religious movement than as a political maneuver. It coincided with the broader Protestant Reformation. Henry forced the entire country into the new church and executed dissenters. This schism permanently altered English history and resulted in religious strife for years to come. Henry married Anne Boleyn. When Anne produced only a daughter, Elizabeth, and a stillborn son, Henry came to believe himself cursed. He accused Anne of witchcraft and had her executed. He then married Jane Seymour, who bore him a son, Edward, but died from complications after childbirth. Henry married 3 more times after Jane, but aside from Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, he had no other surviving children. Henry VIII's only son, Edward VI, ascended the throne in 1547. However, Edward died before the age of 16 from tuberculosis. During his short reign, England experienced a radical Protestant shift. After Edward, his half-sister Mary came to the throne. A devout Catholic married to Philip of Spain, Mary sought to restore Catholicism in England. Her reign was marked by the loss of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, to France in 1558 and by severe persecution of Protestants. Roughly 280 Protestants were burned at the stake, earning her the epithet Bloody Mary. Mary died in 1558 without an heir. Following Mary's death, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I ascended the throne and launched what became known as the Elizabethan Golden Age in English history. Elizabeth re-established the Protestant Church of England while showing a degree of tolerance toward Catholics. She strengthened state institutions and the population grew significantly. Great writers such as William Shakespeare produced their works during this era. England's economic and military power expanded as trade in America and Asia grew. Seafarers like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake led England toward becoming a formidable naval power. Elizabeth never married and had no children, earning her the title the Virgin Queen. Her refusal to marry stemmed in part from fear that a marriage might introduce political instability. Nevertheless, she had many suitors, including Robert Dudley, who was deeply devoted to her. Dudley both courted the Queen and sought to be her close ally. Despite Elizabeth's cautious policies, hostile Catholic powers opposed her. She sought to break the Franco-Scottish alliance by promoting Protestantism in Scotland. The Catholic Scottish Queen, Mary Queen of Scots, was recognized by Catholic Europe as the legitimate sovereign of England. Mary married Henry Stuart, a Catholic claimant to the English throne. Elizabeth imprisoned Mary for 18.5 years and eventually executed her on charges of plotting assassination. This action inflamed the anger of King Philip of Spain. Mary had bequeathed her claim to Philip in her will. Philip vowed to put a Catholic ruler on the English throne and secured papal support. He prepared the Spanish fleet. However, Sir Francis Drake's raids and bad weather caused the Armada's defeat against English strategies. In her famous speech to her troops, Elizabeth said, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Thus she protected England and Protestantism from foreign rule. By standing up to Spanish power, she opened the way for England to become an international power. She died in 1603 and went down in history as the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty. The most complicated period of 17th century England was ignited by long-standing tensions between the Crown and Parliament, deepening religious divisions, and the personal stance of the king. The great conflict produced by these factors became the bloody process known in history as the English Civil War. The war echoed through every layer of society and profoundly shook the country's political structure. As a result, the centuries-old monarchical order was temporarily abolished in a manner rarely seen in history. Charles, who acceded in 1625, opened a crucial chapter in English history. Unlike his father James I, he combined courage with reckless stubbornness. He was determined never to yield his will under any circumstances. This attitude paved the way that would, years later, lead him to the scaffold. Much of his reign was consumed by seemingly endless clashes with Parliament over both ecclesiastical and state governance. Charles's policies produced widespread resentment. He remained silent in the face of persecutions carried out by Archbishop Laud and other clerical authorities, and the targeting of Puritans in London pushed many Calvinist Anglicans toward nonconformity. This increased the number of Presbyterians and roughly tripled the ranks of dissenters. Notable examples of the Star Chamber's harsh punishments included the case of Dr. John Bastwick, who had his ears cut off for criticising the archbishops, and the punishment of William Prynne over a book associated with Queen Henrietta Maria. On top of these grievances, the king's imposition of ship money without parliamentary consent further inflamed public anger. The king also tried to reshape the church according to his own view, imposing episcopal government and high church doctrine on the Scottish church, which had strong Puritan, Presbyterian traditions. This provoked a major uprising in Scotland, the Bishops' Wars, where the Scots resisted resolutely and ultimately routed the king's forces. After these setbacks in Scotland and the depletion of the treasury, Charles was forced to summon Parliament. The short Parliament of 1640 declared it would address grievances before granting funds, and the king dissolved it within 3 weeks. However, confronted with an active Scottish army occupying northern counties, Charles had to recall Parliament later that same year, producing the Long Parliament. That assembly remained in session for years, challenging whether royal prerogative or the will of the House of Commons would prevail. This period saw John Pym emerge as a powerful leader who united discontented groups and earned the nickname King Pym. The Long Parliament moved swiftly against royal ministers. In November 1640 it succeeded in impeaching Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, the King's Lord Deputy of Ireland. What began as an impeachment became effectively a Bill of Attainder. Strafford's proposal to bring the Irish army into England was decisive in securing his conviction. He was executed in May 1641. Archbishop Laud was deprived of office in December 1641 and later executed. In October 1641 a major national and religious uprising broke out in Ireland. Catholic Irishmen clashed with English settlers, and leaders such as Sir Phelim O'Neill claimed to act with royal authority. A forged letter bearing the royal seal was even produced. This deception led English royalist supporters to accuse Charles I of encouraging the rebellion, intensifying anti-royalist sentiment. Rising tensions turned into open war when Charles raised his royal standard at Nottingham on the 22nd of August, 1642, the formal outbreak of the English Civil War. The conflict quickly spread across the country and began a period dominated by large battles that would determine the war's course. Early phases were shaped by complex alliances. By the end of 1643 the Royalists had notable successes in Yorkshire and the southwest. Both sides sought foreign assistance. In September 1643 Parliament signed a crucial treaty with Scotland, which included commitments to protect the Scottish Church and to restructure the English Church along Presbyterian principles. The war produced battles that entered history. The Battle of Marston Moor in 1644 gave the parliamentary forces a strategic victory. The Battle of Naseby in June 1645 had even greater significance. The King's Field Army suffered a crushing defeat and its infantry was effectively destroyed. Oliver Cromwell, Member of Parliament for Huntingdon, became the symbol of parliamentary success thanks to his impressive cavalry leadership and military discipline. Royalist hopes under commanders like the Marquis of Montrose in Scotland ended as forces disintegrated after bright beginnings. Charles effectively became a fugitive in England. In the war's final phase, control passed decisively to the army, particularly to the independence faction. By June 1647 they marched on London and secured a temporary majority in Parliament, offering the king unexpectedly generous terms. But Charles's endless intrigue soon stalled negotiations. By late 1648 the army under Cromwell's influence forcibly purged Parliament. The Rump Parliament that remained continued with the king's trial. Charles I was brought before the High Court of Justice, charged with treason, an unprecedented step in English history. On the 30th of January 1649 a king was executed before the eyes of the people. That execution announced to the world the end of the long-standing monarchy and the proclamation of England as a republic. With the monarchy abolished, England entered a new, rulerless period. Officially styled as a commonwealth, the republic had to confront internal and external crises in its early years. Oliver Cromwell was first assigned to suppress royalist and Catholic forces in Ireland. His 1649 campaigns were remembered for harsh repression and brutalities directed at both civilians and combatants. These measures solidified parliamentary control over Ireland. He then turned to Scotland, where in 1650 Charles's son, proclaimed Charles II in Scotland, was declared king. Cromwell's victories at Dunbar, 1650, and Worcester, 1651, brought Scotland under parliamentary control and forced Charles II into exile. In December 1653, Cromwell dissolved the Rump and established a new constitutional arrangement called the Instrument of Government, assuming the title Lord Protector for life. The new constitution envisioned representation from Scotland and Ireland, redistributed seats away from decayed boroughs, and aimed to broaden parliamentary representation. But when Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard lacked his father's charisma. Political stability collapsed and Richard resigned in May 1659. The ensuing power vacuum encouraged the restoration of the monarchy. General George Monk, then governor in Scotland, marched his army to London and supported restoring the monarchy. Negotiations with Charles II produced the Declaration of Breda, offering amnesty, reconciliation, and guarantees of a future constitutional settlement. When Charles II returned to England in May 1660, the monarchy was restored. The Cromwellian army was disbanded. An Act of Indemnity and Oblivion was passed, pardoning most who had fought against the king, though those involved in Charles I's execution were excluded. 13 regicides were executed. The bodies of Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, and Henry Ireton were exhumed and symbolically hanged and beheaded, a dramatic display that marked a definitive end to the short Republican experiment. England, Scotland, and Ireland were once again united under the Crown. The Restoration of 1660 brought relief to many. Charles II returned after years of exile, during which his life in Holland, France, and Germany had often been marked by financial hardship. Those experiences made him a more cautious and pragmatic ruler. His priority became avoiding conflict with his people and preserving the throne. Restoration rhetoric promised forgetting past grievances and tolerance. The army of the Commonwealth was stood down, and the king began to receive an annual income, historically estimated at around £1,200,000. Yet the Act of Indemnity did not cover those involved in the regicide. 13 of the regicides were executed and the bodies of Cromwell, Bradshaw, and Ireton were exhumed and subjected to posthumous execution, an ignoble act of vengeance given the era's bitter politics. Significant changes also took place in the Church. Charles II re-established the Church of England and enforced conformity with the Act of Uniformity, which led to the ejection of more than 2,000 Puritan ministers. This measure was in some eyes a form of retaliation against Presbyterians who had earlier pressured Anglican clergy. As a result, the country's religious landscape changed profoundly and Anglicanism was re-entrenched as the established state religion. During the first 7 years of his reign, the office of Prime Minister was effectively held by Edward Hyde, Lord Clarendon. Clarendon attempted to strike a balanced approach between royal prerogative and the powers of Parliament. However, he failed to fully grasp the political dynamics of the age. He neither managed to secure the king's wholehearted support nor gained Parliament's confidence. He was removed from office and sent into exile. With his fall from the scene, governance passed into the hands of a 5-man cabal chosen by Charles. Formed from the initials of their surnames, this group comprised Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale. The presence of 2 Catholic ministers increased suspicions about the king's hidden intentions. Those suspicions were not unfounded. Charles secretly signed the Treaty of Dover with France's Louis XIV. That agreement envisaged substantial financial and military aid from France on condition that Catholicism be restored in England. Only Charles, Arlington, and Clifford were aware of the secret details of this pact. The affair later became one of the most striking betrayals recorded in history. The so-called Popish plot emerged from the claims of Titus Oates, a clergyman of dubious moral character, who alleged a wide-ranging conspiracy to murder the king and establish Catholic dominance in England. These allegations provoked deep anti-Catholic fury and fear in society and opened the way for the execution of many innocent people. Ironically, Charles himself was engaged in secret plans, backed by France, to restore Catholicism. After 25 turbulent years on the throne, Charles died having exercised remarkable autocratic power. He had won the loyalty of a large part of the people, created a standing army, and governed for 3 years without calling Parliament. But the person to inherit his power would not be able to maintain it. His brother James II was a stronger and more resilient character than Charles. Morally and in courage he could be seen as superior to his brother, yet he was also stubborn, bigoted, and harsh. When he ascended the throne, the conditions seemed to favour him. The Tory party supported him. Yet James's attempts to re-establish Catholicism threatened the strong Protestant loyalties of the English people. The Monmouth Rebellion of 1685 was quickly crushed, which encouraged James to press ahead even more determinedly with his Catholicizing agenda. But the bloody assizes that followed left deep wounds in the national conscience. Judge Jeffreys's executions of hundreds and the transportation of thousands into servitude overseas provoked widespread resentment and alarm across the kingdom. Nevertheless, James accelerated the appointment of Catholics to important offices and advanced plans to create a standing army. The turning point came with the trial of the 7 bishops in 1688. 7 bishops refused to read the king's declaration of indulgence in their churches and were prosecuted as traitors. The jury found the bishops not guilty, and the verdict was met with jubilant acclaim by the people of London. Even soldiers of the king celebrated. This episode provided the spark that ended James's reign. That same year, the birth of a Catholic son to James prompted Protestant nobles and parliamentarians into action. The prospect of a Catholic heir prompted them to invite William of Orange, the husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to England. William landed with a powerful army, expecting James's regime to collapse under its own weight. James panicked and fled to France, effectively abandoning the throne. The Glorious Revolution, accomplished with little bloodshed, was settled by a convention parliament. William accepted only a nominal regency for his father-in-law, or rather did not wish to serve merely as his wife's consort. In the end, William and Mary were declared joint sovereigns with equal rights. By signing the Bill of Rights, they formally acknowledged the supremacy of Parliament. That document was a turning point that significantly curtailed monarchical powers and strengthened parliamentary authority. The new King William was reserved and distant by temperament. He distrusted the English and was aware that many regarded him as a political necessity rather than a beloved monarch. The English political scene of the time, in William's words, was full of a gang of base and fraudulent knaves and hypocrites, self-interested politicians lacking moral authority. Yet despite the political chaos, the Glorious Revolution moved England from absolute monarchy toward constitutional government and laid the foundations for its future development. After the violent civil wars of the 17th century, England's political structure underwent a profound transformation. The attainment of stability fostered a greater sense of unity and the emergence of a new centre of power. In 1707, the Parliaments of England and Scotland were united and the Kingdom of Great Britain was formally created. This union established the basis for centralised authority and, later with Ireland's inclusion in the 18th century, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Institutional unity was achieved, providing the framework that would support the infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution and create the conditions for Britain to become a global power. The accession of the Hanoverian dynasty at the start of the 18th century ushered in a period of greater political maturity. George I, the first Hanoverian monarch, was unfamiliar with England's political and social dynamics. However, by delegating powers to his ministers, he helped the rise of party government. During this era, expanding trade and mercantilist policies made Britain an international maritime empire, supported by the unquestioned naval superiority provided by the Royal Navy. But this rise was not only the product of political stability. The deeper engine behind Britain's emergence on the world stage was the quiet but profound technological transformation developing at home. The Industrial Revolution began as a massive leap that turned tranquil villages into smoky, fiery centres of production. At the heart of this change was a local industrialist named Abraham Darby. While charcoal had been used for centuries in ironworking, Darby's introduction of coke-based fuel allowed iron to be melted at higher temperatures and for longer durations. This innovation reduced costs and expanded access to iron. The wider availability of this strong material transformed iron production and is credited as the initial spark of the Industrial Revolution. While smelting iron ore was a major challenge, transporting the finished material posed a separate problem. The Darby family provided a solution that tested contemporary imagination: the iron bridge. More than a transport structure, it served as a showcase for iron technology. Constructed from 384 tons of iron and comprising over 1,700 distinct parts, the bridge applied centuries-old timber joinery techniques to iron with masterful skill. Once rising amid green hills and peaceful scenery, the area became, within 2 decades, the dark and smoky heart of industrial landscape, a place that might remind one of Tolkien's Mordor. That scenery exposed both the grandeur and the grim side of the industrial age. The massive production capacities unleashed by the Industrial Revolution strengthened Britain's colonial ambitions. Merchants began to capture an ever-growing share of global trade. Competitors from France, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal were progressively sidelined in Africa, India, and the Far East. This competition for supremacy drove Britain into overseas conflicts fought to secure commercial dominance. The wars with Spain during the era of Robert Walpole are a striking example of how economic interests could translate directly into military confrontation. During these years, the concept of imperialism emerged on the political agenda and was interpreted in different ways within political circles. For some leaders, this concept reflected a desire to strengthen the bonds between Britain and its colonies, to view the empire as a single entity, and to make the name of Britain a respected force in the civilized world and a source of fear in the eyes of its barbaric neighbors. Yet its opponents dismissed this view as nothing more than arrogance, showmanship, and a loud, boastful style of politics. Despite the conflicting interpretations, the productive power and technological superiority provided by the Industrial Revolution formed the strongest foundation of Britain's ability to build a global empire. The power built upon this foundation elevated the country to a unique position on the world stage. In the 19th century, Britain became an unparalleled global power, marking a period in which it held the title of the largest empire ever to exist. The symbol of this glorious age was Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne at a young age and ruled for a full 63 years. Victoria stood out for her modest lifestyle, sincere demeanor, and her deep awareness of the enormous responsibility she assumed upon becoming queen. Her husband, Prince Albert, deliberately kept his distance from politics, yet served as a valuable advisor to both Victoria and the ministers of the era. He was especially admired for his knowledge and sound judgment in matters of foreign policy. Although the English public did not fully appreciate these qualities during his lifetime, after Albert's death his deep loyalty to his country and the wisdom he possessed came to be remembered with great respect. The most striking aspect of the empire was its vast expansion in Asia, particularly in India. The East India Company continued to turn its commercial interests into military power and expand its influence across the subcontinent. Figures such as Robert Clive strengthened British authority through their heroics in places like Arcot. However, this expansion was marked by bloody and brutal events. The Black Hole incident of 1756 began with the invasion of Calcutta by the Bengali commander Siraj-ud-Daulah. 146 English merchants, officials, soldiers, and women were imprisoned in a dungeon of only 20 square meters. The suffocating heat and lack of air in Bengal claimed the lives of nearly all of them. By the next morning, only 23 had survived. This tragic event sparked British retaliation. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 combined Clive's tactics with the betrayal of the Nawab's minister, Mir Jafar, and resulted in the defeat of an opposing army of 50,000 men with only 72 British casualties. This victory granted Britain control over the wealthy province of Bengal, and Mir Jafar was installed as a puppet ruler. The Indian Rebellion that began in 1857, known as the Sepoy Mutiny, was one of the greatest upheavals at the height of the empire. Rumors spread among Indian soldiers that the new rifle cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat. For both Hindus and Muslims, this was viewed as a religious insult and triggered a major uprising within the army. In the revolt that erupted around Meerut, a leader called Nana Sahib massacred the surrendering British garrison in Cawnpore. Hundreds of women and children were brutally thrown into the Cawnpore well. Such acts of barbarity fueled debates about the brutality of British rule and raised questions about whether the empire truly rested on solid foundations. Despite all these events, the empire continued to expand, and in 1877 Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India at a ceremony in Delhi. This ceremony officially cemented Britain's dominion over the Indian subcontinent. The Victorian era saw major changes and struggles not only in Britain's overseas territories but also within Britain itself. The Chartist movement emerged as a massive wave of discontent against the social injustices created by the Industrial Revolution. The movement expressed frustration over the people's conditions and called for political reform with demands such as universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual parliaments. The Chartists believed in achieving social welfare through lawful means and argued that every worker deserved a good coat, a hat, an adequate dinner, and a wage sufficient for a proper livelihood. However, the movement's impact remained limited due to poor leadership and lack of support from the middle class. Free trade policies gained importance in response to the needs created by a growing population and industrialization. As the country struggled to secure food supplies, it faced difficulties in sustaining protective measures like the Corn Laws. Prime Minister Robert Peel repealed the Corn Laws in 1846. Although this decision was devastating for landowners and farmers, it was viewed as a bold step that aligned with the needs of an industrializing nation. In foreign policy, Britain was drawn into new conflicts in Europe. Russia's ambitions over the Ottoman Empire disturbed the peace of the continent, prompting Britain, along with France, to enter the Crimean War to stop Russian expansion. One of the war's most tragic and symbolic moments came during the Battle of Balaclava. In the clash that began with a Russian assault on British communication lines, the charge of the Heavy Brigade succeeded in halting the enemy. But the subsequent charge of the Light Brigade, triggered by a misinterpreted order, led 670 cavalrymen into the concentrated fire of Russian artillery, and only a few hundred survived. This suicidal attack became a tragic example of military bureaucracy and leadership failure. Yet during the war, Florence Nightingale's pioneering nursing reforms saved many soldiers' lives and laid the foundations of modern medicine. Ireland remained a constant source of difficulty for Britain throughout the 19th century. The Great Potato Famine inflicted immense misery on the Irish people. Irish-American soldiers returning from the U.S. Civil War founded a group called the Fenian Brotherhood and launched uprisings against Britain, along with plots to invade Canada. The police killings in Manchester and the bombing of Clerkenwell Prison revealed the violence of the era. Later, figures such as Landell, Land League, and Charles Stewart Parnell fought back through acts of resistance against landlords. The Phoenix Park murders exposed the bloody conflicts taking place in Ireland. The problems seen during the Crimean War and France's rapid collapse in 1870–71 revealed Britain's military weaknesses. War Secretary Cardwell restructured the army under a short service system and introduced major reforms by abolishing the purchase of officers' commissions. These new regulations were intended to create a more experienced reserve force. Toward the end of the century, the British Empire clashed with the Boer settlers of Dutch origin in South Africa. Incidents such as the Jameson Raid undermined Boer trust in the British and helped ignite war. The Second Boer War revealed the flaws in Britain's military system and the incompetence of several generals. Yet the strong support provided by the colonies and the imperial sentiment shown by the public demonstrated the depth of the empire's foundations. The Victorian era was a period filled with contradictions, revealing both the triumphs and the hidden darker sides of an empire that had become a global power. This period illustrated, with complete clarity, the empire's victories as well as the burdens it carried. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire was at the height of its global dominance, yet it faced an emerging threat on the horizon. The wealth provided by the empire, strengthened and expanded by the Industrial Revolution, concealed deep social and economic tensions. World War I exposed these strains and pushed the empire's resources harder than ever before. As the balance of power in Europe deteriorated, Britain found itself at the center of a rapidly escalating global conflict. The losses the country suffered were felt not only on the battlefield but across all levels of society. With millions of men sent to the front, the entire population, including women and children, was mobilized for the war economy. The loss of life and trauma caused by the war left permanent marks on subsequent generations. It became clear that Britain had entered an age in which a way of life was coming to an end. The traditional aristocratic lifestyle was shaken by wartime sacrifices and social changes. Many servants left the great country houses to work in industry and wartime jobs, and they never returned. This stood as evidence that social hierarchies and ways of life that had existed for centuries were undergoing profound transformation. The war effectively brought the nation to the brink of bankruptcy. Massive borrowing and expenditure severely destabilized the economy, marking World War I as the beginning of the end of Britain's supremacy among the world's great powers. London, the global financial center, struggled under the pressures of war as economic power increasingly shifted toward the United States. The government's control over society, in the name of the war effort, increased in ways rarely seen before. National mobilization gave the state authority to intervene in nearly every aspect of social life, leading to significant restrictions on traditional civil liberties. Although the empire maintained its largest territorial extent on the map, the war revealed the immense cost of maintaining dominance over far-flung territories. Soldiers and resources from the colonies made major contributions to the war effort, but this also laid the groundwork for the rise of independence movements. After the war, the colonies' desire to determine their own futures grew even stronger, foreshadowing the eventual dissolution of the empire. World War I left lasting effects on Britain's domestic and foreign policies. Economic hardships, demands for social reform, and searches for national identity became defining features of the post-war era. A country already weakened by World War I faced an even greater destruction and hardship only 20 years later. That war is regarded as one of the most consequential events in England's history and severely damaged the country's economy. It also accelerated the end of Britain's global supremacy. Wartime measures produced radical changes in national life. The government assumed control and allocated once grand private estates, symbols of national wealth, to military use. Those places became quarters for military personnel. Officers occupied luxurious bedrooms while dining halls were converted to messes. This signaled that the pre-war world was gone and that the nation faced a grave threat. People had to live in shelters against aerial attacks. Cities were bombed, and food, fuel, and other essentials were rationed. Intense bombardments like the London Blitz both tested civilian resilience and fostered a spirit of national unity. During this difficult period, Britain's resistance demonstrated national resolve and solidarity. Winston Churchill's leadership became the emblem of this resistance. Although specific sources may not detail every aspect of Churchill's leadership style, his resolute stance and stirring rhetoric united the nation and steered it toward victory. His promises of blood, toil, tears, and sweat gave people courage in desperate times. Churchill became etched in the public memory as an English hero, standing firm against every effort to break the country's will. Despite German air raids, critical decisions were taken in secret underground command centers reminiscent of wartime operation hubs, and people strove to sustain life even amid bombardments. This was a testament to national organization and resilience. The technological innovations of war also highlighted British ingenuity. The post-war panorama revealed that the empire's global role had fundamentally changed and that the nation had to adapt to a new international order. Although Britain won the war, it was crushed under the destruction of 2 world wars and entered a period of economic difficulty. Lend-Lease aid from the United States increased the country's economic dependence and signaled a shift in global power toward the US. Britain was no longer the undisputed world leader. At the start of a new era, it needed to redefine its identity and place in the world. The devastation and heavy economic burden of World War II made direct governance of Britain's vast overseas territories impossible. After the war, Britain confronted a very different world. This new reality was shaped by expanding democracy, social welfare, and a retreating empire. Wartime sacrifices and social solidarity created the basis for a welfare state. Important institutions such as a National Health Service were established, and wide-ranging reforms were implemented in education and housing. The sacrifices made during the war were interpreted by the public as a right to greater social security from the state, laying the foundations of the welfare state. The empire's collapse accelerated. Irish independence in 1922 was an early and critical sign of this transformation. After World War II, rising autonomy demands and nationalist movements in colonies across Asia and Africa made direct rule neither feasible nor desirable for Britain. The independence of India in 1947 dealt the greatest blow to the empire, and other colonies soon followed. African countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya and Asian territories such as Malaysia and Singapore achieved independence in the 1950s and 1960s. This marked the symbolic end of Britain's global dominance, but it was not an absolute end so much as a transformation. The empire evolved into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association. This transition reflected an attempt to reshape relationships with former colonies and signaled a shift in global power balances. The Commonwealth became a network of independent states united by shared values, history, and interests. It represented an effort to replace a formally imposed imperial order with a more equal and cooperative structure. This process forced Britain to reconsider its role in international politics. Influence would increasingly rest on diplomacy and soft power rather than solely on military and economic might. Although the empire physically shrank, its cultural and linguistic legacy continued to exert deep influence worldwide. After World War II, the world faced a new confrontation and the threat of a Cold War. The ideological and geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, combined with the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, shook the globe. As one of the United States' closest allies, Britain had to fundamentally revise its defense strategies against the possibility of nuclear attack. During this era, secret underground bunkers were constructed across the country to ensure regional governance could continue even if cities and vital infrastructure were destroyed. These bunkers became deemed necessary after the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in 1945 and the terrifying reality of nuclear war became clear. Britain developed its own atomic bomb in 1953 and committed to a nuclear weapons program. This period saw major increases in military spending and a new focus on civil defense preparedness. These shelters were run by a volunteer organization called the Royal Observer Corps and were intended to provide critical information and maintain national coordination in exceptional circumstances. The Corps was tasked with collecting data on the scale and potential of nuclear attacks. Maps inside the bunkers were used to continuously monitor bomb locations and radiation spread. Trained personnel working behind the screens were stationed to interpret and distribute the most vital information for national defense. These facilities resembled places such as Barrel of Britain's Operation Room and served as repositories for the country's most critical defense data. The era reinforced the need for constant vigilance and a deep awareness of global danger. The nuclear threat became part of daily life, and citizens were encouraged to prepare for a possible attack. These shelters stand as concrete examples of the psychological impact of the Cold War on ordinary people and illustrate how far a nation might go when faced with existential peril. Britain's history can be read as a story of continual adaptation and change. With the hardships of the post-war era and the collapse of the empire, the nation embarked on a search for a new identity. Though I do not have specific up-to-date details about contemporary issues like membership in or departure from the European Union, Britain's ability throughout history to overcome challenges and adapt to change remains the defining feature of its destiny. From ancient stone circles to magnificent medieval castles, from the intense years of the Industrial Revolution to Cold War underground bunkers, Britain's story is one of rebirth and survival in the face of hardship. This history reveals human struggles for survival, the overcoming of natural obstacles, compromise and conflict, innovation and creativity. Millennia of heritage have shaped the rich and diverse character of England, and of Britain more broadly, today. This transformative journey offers a unique perspective on how events from the past continue to influence the nation's identity and present condition. The crises, civil wars, industrial and technological revolutions, imperial expansions, and collapses are the pivotal turning points that define Britain's character and its role in the world.